This is a Patreon-only exclusive. Can Saudi Arabia reduce its reliance on US military equipment? Written by Isaac Gibson, edited by McCagh, and voiced by Michael Hilliard. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia has been a major importer of US military hardware and platforms. But in the face of increasing questions about the strength of the alliance and rising geopolitical tensions, is Saudi Arabia about to pivot away from US military equipment? The Red Lion's Isaac Gibson explores the sources of the current tensions and what the Saudi options are should they wish to replace their dependency on the United States. President Joe Biden's attempted return to pragmatism in Saudi Arabia has been met with stern recalcitrance by Riyadh's mercurial leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or better known as MBS. Since July's meeting between the two leaders, domestic pressure is growing for Riyadh and Washington to reevaluate their long-standing partnership, threatening to upend decades of strategic cooperation and fundamental regional security frameworks. MBS's controversial efforts to modernize his father's kingdom and strengthen influence abroad have given rise to a duality of repression and incremental reform. Most recently, Biden has struggled to build a balanced and yet coherent relationship with the Saudi monarchy, and in such has drawn criticism from all sides of Washington. Recent disagreements on oil production in response to the war in Ukraine and the perception of a growing Saudi hedge against the Americans' shifting footprint in the region have led analysts to speculate that MBS is in the market for new security partners. This concept was demonstrated in early 2022 after one of Saudi Arabia's largest investors, Kingdom Holding, invested $500 million into Russia's Gazprom, Rosneft, and Lukoil, despite global sanctions against the Kremlin. Not surprisingly, many observers believe that the US-Saudi relations have reached a historical inflection point, and future defense cooperation will decline in the coming years. If Riyadh and Washington's breakup were to happen, how would that affect regional security though? And what would it take for Saudi Arabia to decouple from the US military platforms? This particular question dates back to the 1940s, as the Saudis have played a crucial role in supporting US foreign policy, both as a political fulcrum of the Muslim world and as a major energy supplier. Sustained by shared strategic interests, both nations have operated in lockstep to promote diplomacy and defense cooperation. A decade later, in 1951, Riyadh and Washington signed the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement to ensure long-term security and political stability for petroleum companies operating inside Saudi Arabia. As the first formal defense agreement between both countries, it secured US military training, assistance, arms transfers, and equipment for the Saudis' nascent armed forces, serving as the centerpiece in Washington's Cold War containment strategy for the Near East. Although America's active military role in the region and support for Saudi Arabia's campaign to export Wahhabism did tip the scale against the Soviets, these policies have also hampered US-Saudi relations. Moving forward into the subsequent decades, the Middle East will be plagued by primordial sectarianism and human insecurity, often driving a wedge between both partners. Nevertheless, despite disagreements on Israel, a legacy of mistrust following both the events of 9/11 and the instances of public policy disputes within Washington's Congress, US-Saudi cooperation has managed to weather major geopolitical shifts. But now in 2022, Beijing has emerged as a major player within the region, forging significant inroads with the promises of a no political strings attached investment strategy, and a burgeoning role as the arms exporter to the Arab world. Many analysts believe that China's rising position as a near-peer competitor legitimately threatens the symbiosis of Washington and Riyadh's strategic relationship. When it comes to Beijing and Riyadh, both countries have already established mechanisms for cooperation on Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and Riyadh's Saudi Vision 2030. Moreover, to Washington's dismay, the kingdom's ambivalence to Russia's war in Ukraine has demonstrated a willingness for further bilateral energy cooperation with Moscow. Riyadh has refused to condemn Russia's invasion and, most recently, rejected demands from the EU and the US to stabilize oil costs through increasing production. Compounded by the political pressure from American fatigue in the Middle East, these events further call into question Washington's ability to achieve its long-term objectives. However, despite Washington's recent pivot towards the Indo-Pacific and recent geopolitical shifts, it is unlikely China or Russia intends to fulfill America's role as the region's primary security guarantor. Nevertheless, it is worth examining Washington and Riyadh's long-standing defense ties to understand MBS's future security calculus. Part 2. A brief history. Between 1820 and 1971, Britain stood as the dominant power broker in the region, But following Britain's withdrawal from the Persian Gulf, the US began rapidly consolidating its use of hard power in the region, primarily through expanded arms sales to neighbouring countries. Between 1970 and 1972, Riyadh increased purchases from US arms from $14.8 to $296.3 million, acting as a boon for the American defence industry. Moreover, by the late 1970s, the broader MENA region, or Middle East North Africa region, became embroiled in interstate rivalry and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Fueling a regional arms race, military spending by the Gulf states alone had reached 13 to 15% of their gross national product by the end of the 1970s, with many of these countries remaining among the top 10 countries globally for military spending per capita. According to one congressional study, roughly 10,000 American civil defense contractors were working in Saudi Arabia by the year 1978. However, the dependence on American technology has come at a cost to the Gulf partners, as countries heavily reliant on foreign technicians and weapons platforms usually fail to develop indigenous military industries, a problem Saudi Arabia has only recently scrambled to solve. In stark contrast, Iran first established its arms development program and defense industrial base during the Iran-Iraq War in the early 80s, in order to shield itself from Western weapon embargoes. Alternatively, Israel began developing its defense industry shortly after the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, devoting roughly 5% of its GDP on research and development annually, and in such is now one of the world's largest weapons exporters. As the largest partner of the US foreign military sales program during the 1960s and 70s, Iran dominated the region's arms race, deemed by one US congressman as the most rapid build-up of military power under peacetime conditions by any nation in the history of the world. At the time, Iran imported $20 billion worth of arms and military hardware from the United States, with the period in question being between 1970 and 1978. Willing to embrace America's twin pillars policy in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran received heavy support through arms transfers and political backing under the Nixon Doctrine. Alongside one another, Washington saw Riyadh and Tehran's regional leadership as crucial for halting the spread of communism throughout the Middle East. Nevertheless, everything would change after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, ushering in an enduring era of sectarian hatred and hegemonic rivalry with no sign of rapprochement, with the ensuing dynamic being described as the Middle Eastern Cold War. Iran and Saudi Arabia's battle for supremacy has now produced a complex web of proxy relationships throughout the Middle East, with Riyadh and Tehran throwing their support behind regimes and other non-state armed groups. Part 3. The Defense of the Kingdom. Given the region's legacy of insecurity, Saudi Arabia's force structure reflects its hostile neighborhood, confronting attacks on energy and essential infrastructure, most typically from threats to its airspace. Since the Iran-Iraq War, Saudi Arabia has prioritized air defense capabilities by investing in aerial interception and missile defense platforms. With Saudi Arabia being the largest financial backer of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980, Saudi Arabia faced frequent retaliation from Iranian Scud-B missiles and F-4 Phantom fighter jets. The following year, US President Ronald Reagan approved an $8.5 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia that included the transfer of 62 F-15 fighter aircraft, advanced tanks, and 5 airborne warning and control systems, or AWACS, providing the Royal Saudi Armed Forces with aerial surveillance and defensive air superiority against Iran. America's F-15SAs and F-15 Eagles have proven fundamental to the Royal Saudi Air Force fighter jet program, as the RSAF receives frequent platform upgrades and routine maintenance support from US technicians, with these systems including the Raytheon AN/TPY-2 missile defense radar and the Raven Industries Vista F-25 to augment its F-15 programs. However, it is important to note that Saudi Arabia does not own or operate exclusively American-made fighter craft. In addition to its F-15s, the RSAF possesses a sizable fleet of capable Eurofighter Typhoons and British Tornado fighter jets. Following Riyadh's $5.9 billion Eurofighter deal in 2007 with Britain, MBS could look to other countries for aircraft such as France's Dassault Rafales or China's FC-31 stealth fighters. In theory, while diversifying the RSAF supply chain would mitigate the risk of political fallout with Washington, relying on too many different weapons platforms could stymie operational integration. Moreover, the United States has the largest defense industry in the world, one capable of innovating, resupplying, and maintaining weapon systems quicker than most other countries. And when you ask pilots, these change of systems are a big deal, as it can take nearly years for pilots to adapt to new aircraft systems, which directly threatens and jeopardizes the RSAF's near-term missions and power projection throughout the Gulf. In addition to its air force, Saudi Arabia has also heavily invested in American-made Integrated Air Defense Systems, or IADs, most notably during the 1991 Gulf War. After purchasing variations of the American Hawk medium-range air defense system in the 1980s, Saudi Arabia upgraded to the Patriot PAC-2 surface-to-air missile in 1991 to intercept Iraqi Scud ballistic missiles. Per official Saudi sources, of the 31 Iraqi missiles launched at Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, the Patriot system achieved a successful interception rate of nearly 80%, with only one civilian reported killed. Not only did Saudi Arabia's use of the PAC-2 system during the Gulf War protect the kingdom from aerial threats, but it also proved crucial in supporting the multinational coalition against Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. In the aftermath of the Gulf War conflict, Riyadh has since doubled down on its aerial interception capabilities by upgrading to America's successor Patriot, the PAC-3, the MIM-104E, and recently purchased the $15 billion Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD system, to address evolving threats from the war in Yemen and putting its aerial defense capabilities on par with Israel, the UAE, and Egypt. As a key player in Yemen's 8-year civil war, Saudi Arabia has now poured billions of dollars into what has become an intractable proxy conflict against Iran and one of the worst humanitarian crises anywhere in the world. Faced with continued UAV and ballistic missile attacks from the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, Saudi Arabia has boxed itself into a corner with no clear exit strategy from the conflict. According to Saudi sources, Houthi rebels launched nearly 1,204 drones and 1,207 missiles into Saudi Arabia between March 2015 and August 2019 alone. Only until the THAAD platform becomes operational in 2026 can both missile systems operate independently as a multi-layered defense structure capable of intercepting short-range and high-altitude threats. In the immediate term, though, Riyadh will continue depending solely on the Patriot system, which does have its drawbacks. Houthi rebels have increasingly conducted attacks using low-range, low-altitude cruise missiles and UAVs, which are difficult for the Patriot system's conventional high-frequency radars to even detect. Moreover, Riyadh has reportedly run low on Patriot missiles this year, and may seek to bolster its air defense with other countries' systems from within the region. Although on paper, Russia's new S-400 system is a cheaper alternative, capable of targeting threats at lower altitudes, up to 10 meters, as compared with the Patriot system to 60 meters, it remains relatively unproven in combat, and would make Saudi Arabia the target of American sanctions. Riyadh may be more likely to opt for a less controversial system, like South Korea's medium-range Chang'an-2, the KM-SAM, or even Israel's Barak 8 platform. Saudi Arabia's close partner, the UAE, has already purchased both systems, and the Barak 8 is capable of targeting low-flying drones and missiles. But both systems would allow Riyadh to augment its defense structure and convey to its partners that it isn't beholden to American-made technology, whilst at the same time not ruffling too many feathers. Part 4. The future of the friendship. For more reasons than not, abruptly severing security cooperation between Saudi Arabia and the US would not be in the interests of either country. Disentangling Saudi ties to American technology poses several large logistical issues for the kingdom. And if MBS were to cut security cooperation with the US altogether, Saudi Arabia would have to immediately supplement nearly 80% of its current arms imports. Although Beijing has recently positioned itself as a viable alternative by marketing air defense systems, multi-type drones, fighter aircraft, and even promising to help develop entire defense industry value chains, China's investment strategy, principled on neutrality with states like Iran, could alternatively encourage Riyadh to keep Washington as its fundamental security guarantor. After all, countering Iran's regional sphere of influence remains paramount for MBS's national security strategy, so growing its security ties with any of Iran's counterparts could backfire on them long term. Even as its relations sit at a new low, long-term joint military planning between the US Central Command, or CENTCOM, and Saudi Arabia is continuing, such as the Red Sands Integrated Experimentation Center and other anticipated exchange programs. Furthermore, the Saudi Defense Ministry did voice its support for the reorganization of the US military training mission within Riyadh earlier this year. While the US-Saudi relationship has reached a new low point, security initiatives like these can be impetus for renewed dialogue and reconciliation between both partners. Can Saudi Arabia reduce its reliance on US military equipment? Written by Isaac Gibson and edited by McCagh. Michael's note. I think Isaac's pretty spot on here with most of his analysis. And the only thing I think I would add here is the reliance on countries for spare parts. This is a major problem also facing people like the Indians, where because Saudi Arabia spends so long using US military equipment, if they were to diversify themselves away from it, they would have to go back to the US to acquire spare parts for any of their tanks, guns, or any other bits of equipment they currently use. Just like if India were to cut ties with Russia and one of their tanks blew a gearbox or blew an exhaust system, then they would have to throw the entire tank away rather than just requesting the spare parts from Russia. Transitioning your entire military away from one security partner to another is not a particularly easy thing. We can see this in the EU as well, with countries like Bulgaria still using a lot of ex-Soviet military equipment, a real oddity within the Eurozone. If you want to go further into this, we actually did a full piece on Saudi Arabia not too long ago now. Otherwise, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them as well. In any case, thanks again to our fantastic Patreons. I hope you enjoy this bonus content, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.